Jessie, Hong Kong's so lucky to have you with us. You know, it's truly a terrific honor. And I'll be hosting and moderating this session. And before we start, allow me to just begin by introducing Jessie, a wonderful, wonderful writer who grew up shuttling back and forth between Indonesia, Singapore, and Oxford. And she considers all three places a home, with a master's from Oxford University. So one of us, you know, we share the same university. She has yet to figure out how to say that without sounding obnoxious. I hope I've said that for you and therefore resolved your conundrum there. Jessie has 42 first cousins and 30 aunties and uncles, many of whom live just down the road. Is that true? In Jakarta, I presume. Great. And Jessie, thank you so much once again for being here in Hong Kong. Thank you. So I believe you have a presentation, so I'm going to just pass the floor over to you to talk us through, some of your stories and insights and reflections on, how we self-motivate, which is a very germane question for many of us here in the audience. So on that note, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming here. So I love giving a talk on self-motivation, especially in the face of rejection, because it took me 10 years before I got my first book deal, which is a really long time. So I prepared a short slideshow. So this is a little bit about me and my what I've published so far. So I'm the author of Dial A for Aunties, and most recently, Vera Wong's Unsolicited Advice for Murderers. I also write young adult and children's books. And most excitingly, Dial A for Aunties was bought by Netflix, and Vera Wong was bought by Warner Brothers, with Oprah Winfrey and Mindy Kaling set to produce. And they both sold in a very competitive auction, so I'm very excited about that. So I graduated from the master's course in creative writing from Oxford University, and when I graduated, I was like, oh yeah, I have a degree from Oxford University, I am hot shit. Like, publishers are gonna be knocking down my door, begging me for a book, so they didn't. It took me 10 years, like I said, and in those 10 years, I made a lot of mistakes. And I just wanted to share with you the top 3 mistakes that I made. So I believed very outdated approaches to writing. So a few of my favorite authors were Terry Pratchett, Stephen King. They're older writers. Well, Sir Terry Pratchett has passed away now, unfortunately. But I would read their interviews, and so I would be like, oh, I believed in their practices, which is that they were mostly isolated. And I had this image of like writers who are kind of working in like a cabin in the woods, away from everyone, and they would only emerge when their masterpiece was done. I also had some paranoia because I believe oh my God, everyone is out to steal my brilliant ideas. And also I believe that being a writer somehow makes me special or unique. I was always saying to my husband, like don't talk to me, I'm creating art, but all of these were mistakes, as I'm sure. Well, I don't know, Brian. We'll have to come to you next. But I found out that creating art today is very different. It has a lot with finding your community. And I would love to discuss that with you, Brian, because communities give you so much. They give you feedback, emotional support, advice, and all that stuff. I also learned the importance of giving and receiving critiques, learning how to receive feedback, and all of these things were it took me a long time to kind of learn. I don't know, it just didn't come naturally to me. I don't know if it's, the same for you. I'm
not a natural.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course, I also found like some not so great communities. There's this like thing about brutal honesty that I really don't like, because I don't understand why honesty needs to be brutal. And I find that a lot of people kind of mistake that for just being terrible humans. So these were my problems, and I would love to hear from you about this. So I had both low self-esteem and also very unrealistic expectations. So on one hand, I think of myself as like a trash raccoon, just rooting around in the garbage and coming up with more trash. And then on the other hand, I also believe that I'm going to come up with this incredible masterpiece. And somehow these two sides exist within one very tortured author. And of course, this leads to perfectionism, which leads to a real lack of routine. And here, I would love to stop and ask you, Brian, if you can relate to any of this stuff.
For sure, I think the imposter syndrome is a very ubiquitous phenomenon, especially amongst high-achieving individuals, incredibly successful in their own right, and yet there's always this difficulty, right, where you strain to internalize your achievements and you feel that all of this ain't real, it's just something that others have foisted upon you, right? Can you pretend or maintain the pretense till forever? And that's sort of the nagging sense of frustration and self-doubt that many are plagued by. So it's so wonderful that you'll bring this up here today.
Yeah, so I only learned today that Brian here has released a book about a week ago, and it's doing so well that it's like almost sold out. How do you feel about that? Do you have any, does it feel surreal at all to you?
So this was the second book I'd written, and each and every time I publish a book, it feels surreal, because I'd ask, is it me who's the author, or is it me who's merely an imposter? And that sort of question that lingers, that sense that this ain't real. It's very much something that's part and parcel of being an author, I feel. So, it's great that you're sharing your honest experiences and reflections on that front. And I, for sure, can't quite process the fact that there's a book out there with my name on it. It's probably not mine. It's not mine.
I love that. Do you want to go into a few of your...
Absolutely. And so before we delve into the Q&A, can we please give another round of applause to Jesse? And you can see we've got an expanding room of audience. So it's so great to have you here. So I'm just going to start off with a relatively straightforward question, which is the concept of family and home, because it strikes me that throughout many of your works, really, the notion of the family, a tightly knit one, but also an expanded one beyond the nuclear family, and then this constant search for home, for home to which one can belong. They feature quite prominently in many of your works. Could you perhaps unpack that for us? What do these terms, home and family, mean to you, and how have you sought to channel them in your works? Thank you.
So I think family is such a big concept, especially in Asian cultures, and I really felt the loss of that when I was living overseas, because I lived in Oxford for a few years, and I really missed my family, because I feel like Asian families are very, very, very close. But what's funny is that since writing Dial A for Aunties, I got so many messages from readers all over the world. They're like, how come Nigerian aunties are exactly like this? Or, oh my God, this is Greek aunties or Jewish aunties. And what's funny is that the only ones who are like, oh, this is not at all like my family, but I wish it was, are from Caucasian readers. Who are like, no, why is my family not like this? So I thought it was really interesting that across so many cultures, we have kind of the same concept of family. And I think it's just so wonderful that I've been able to connect to my readers that way.
what do you see as the major differences between, as you said, sort of Caucasian families on one hand, and then you've got Nigerian and Asian families, Indonesian families included, of course, on the other hand? What are the main differences that you've noticed, if any?
Maybe they're less meddlesome. I feel like across so many cultures, like the Asian and Middle East and African countries, apparently, all of our aunties and uncles just kind of lack boundaries and are just so ready to, you know, kind of jump in and run your life for you. And I also find, and I love this, by the way, that wherever I go, I'm always kind of getting told off by random aunties and uncles. Like, just yesterday, I was walking, you know, along the market, and one of the shop uncles spoke to me in Cantonese. So I replied in Mandarin. I was like, "Oh, 对不起，我不讲广东话." And he was like, 小妹呀, he was like, 你的华文那么差. Like, I was like, oh my God, so savage, you know, like. But I love it. Like, I love that you can kind of go anywhere in Asia and just get given unsolicited advice from very random uncles and aunties. And that's why I wrote a book called Vera Wong's Unsolicited Advice for Murderers, because that's just what Asian aunties and uncles do. That, you know, they just give you advice whether or not you want it.
And on the question of advice, you know, this is fascinating because very often we think advice could be benign, right? It's there to help you improve. It's there for your sake. You know, it's often couched in terms of, hey, I'm saying this really because it's for your own good. That's why you should do it. And yet there's also one school of thought and one critique that we've been hearing a lot about the way advice is structured and couched in, especially, say, certain Asian societies, that the advice directed or given towards women are inevitably going to be embedded with, you know, patriarchal or family or expectations concerning how women ought to behave or not to behave. And I was just wondering, in many of your works, there's this almost, I guess, there's a very subtle attempt to both navigate in a positive manner, in a proactive manner, the kind of advice that, you know, rigidly adheres to gender norms, whilst also critiquing these norms from afar, but not from such a distance that it becomes almost aloof. So I was wondering, you know, Jesse, what do you make of the role played by gender and also gender dynamics in your works? Is there an intentional message you're trying to convey there? Is there a critique of the norms you see as, you know, necessary and needed?
Oh, yeah, for sure. So I write and I read a lot of thrillers. And I used to not read thrillers because they used to be very male-dominated. So that means that a lot of women, female characters were getting killed, you know, kind of just to further the plot. And so I do have an agenda, which is I'm going to kill as many male characters as I can to further the female characters' plots. So one thing that I find interesting about gender roles, especially in Asia, is that there are like very strict gender roles. Then up to like a certain age, I find that my aunties, they used to be, I feel like they used to be a lot more, you know, pliant and submissive, maybe. And then they hit menopause, and they're just like, I don't give a crap anymore. And then they run the household. So it's a very interesting kind of dynamics, and this is what I write about in my books. Like Dial A for Aunties and Vera Wong's Unsolicited Advice is about women who kind of have gone past that age of kind of caring how the world sees them. And so they're like, they do whatever the hell they want, you know, and break the law sometimes.
And on that note, let's talk Dial A for Aunties, actually, because, you know, you've got dark humor, slapstick, feminist critique female empowerment, subversion of gender norms and expectations. There's a lot going on in that wonderful read, and it's all packed into, a pretty accessible and compact read that I would strongly recommend that you all get your hands on, by the way. But I was just wondering, what was the main inspiration that undergirded that book, besides everything you've mentioned so far? And I've also got to follow up on Jake and Nathan, but we'll get onto that in a second.
Well, definitely my mom and aunts. So, okay, so I don't know about you, but when I was in Oxford, I met some, I don't know, like some, pretty racially ignorant people. Sorry. I remember there's this older Caucasian lady who was like, oh, my son married this lovely Asian lady, and she's just so, like those Asian people, so submissive and so agreeable. And I was like, oh my goodness, lady, you have not met my mom and my aunts. And she was like, no, like, my daughter-in-law, she is so soft-spoken and so sweet. Oh, thank you. And it kind of inspired me. I was like, people need to learn the truth about Asian women. And so I wrote Dial A for Aunties. And the story is about a young woman who gets set up on, who gets forced into a blind date by her very meddlesome mom and aunts. And then she accidentally kills her blind date, as you do. And then she gets the help of her mother and her aunts to get rid of the body. So it's very realistic, clearly. And she's freaking out. She's like, oh my God, maybe we should go to the police. And her mom and aunts are like, no, like we know better than the police what to do. Okay, so just follow our lead, And it's completely based on my mom and my aunts, even though my mom claims that she would not help me hide a dead body, but we all know she would. Like after my husband read it, he was like, oh my God, if you ever accidentally kill me, I think this is 100% what is going to happen. And he's right. So yeah, that is my inspiration for writing Dial A for Aunties.
That's wonderful, because I was reading actually the piece you wrote for Crime Reads called Meet the Sutantos, How My Wacky Indonesian Family Inspired a Murder Mystery. And I was just wondering, you talk a lot about what you've observed as common traits, right, that are almost, inherent amongst, say, many families or many of these cultural dimensions of the Indonesian society and Asian communities at large, on one hand, and yet also, as you pointed out just then in your comments on that anecdotal encounter with that lady in Oxford, there's a tendency amongst certain folks to generalize about Asians. They say, all Asians are docile, all Asians are, meek, so on and so forth. Is there a worry or a danger ever that when you, as much as you're trying to convey, really, the reality of how Asian communities operate or what they look like and seem like, that you also indirectly reify the kind of essentialisms that we ought to be concerned about, when it comes to portrayals of cultures?
Yeah, so I find it really tricky because that's what happens when you have so little representation, that whatever representation there is then becomes representative of all of it, So I had to include an author's note at the beginning of the book where I kind of remind people, this is not representative of all parts of Asia because it's, Asia is so huge and so diverse that no single work can possibly represent all of it. But I think that this is something every author of color struggles with. And I know that all of our books have had reviews where people are like annoyed because it didn't represent their experience growing up.
And I'm going to sort of zoom in on the cultural background and your personal story in just a second. But one question, just very quickly, we've seen over the past 10 years the rise of mainstream, say Hollywood or large studios, etc., turning and adapting works by persons of color, especially Asian writers, into blockbusters. So an example being Crazy Rich Asians, and that's often cited as a sort of portrayal of the rich and the powerful in Singapore, or more generally speaking, in East Asia. So Jesse, what do you make of this trend of, I know you've got clearly a bidding war over your wonderful works, they're hotly contested. What do you make of this trend of these large studios producing all such movies and films? Do you see it as a positive step in terms of representation, or do you think there's something more to be said about the nature of the representation that happens and is happening?
So I think overall it is a positive step. I think it has opened so many doors for us, and I'm very grateful for it. I feel like I'm realistic enough to know that without Crazy Rich Asians, I don't think that Dial A for Aunties would have sold so well, like that people would have been so excited about it. And, certainly like the Netflix thing, I don't know if that would have happened. But I know that Crazy Rich Asians just created such a demand for more Asian stories. I remember meeting up with a friend who is in the entertainment industry, and he's been struggling, all like for the last 10, 20 years because he's Asian, and there are like no roles for him. And then he said, then Crazy Rich Asians happened, and suddenly he was getting calls for auditions and stuff. So I think on the whole, I am very grateful. But as you pointed out, it is a very narrow expectation of what they are looking for. They still like the super wealthy. And I think that stories about kind of your everyday actual like Asian person living in Asia is still kind of limited. So one of my books, which was a young adult rom-com set in Indonesia, that was also shopped to in Hollywood, and it didn't find a buyer. And I think it's because it is set in Indonesia, whereas the stories like Dial A for Aunties, they're set in America. So I kind of feel like Hollywood wants Asian stories, but they want, like Asian light, like, or
Asian with American influences.
Yes.
Or Asian American stories.
Yeah, exactly.
How can we tackle this?
I think there's nothing that can be done aside from one step at a time, I believe that a rising tide carries all boats. Like, it just takes one successful thing like Crazy Rich Asians, and then we'll have more and more and more.
And I think the next successful thing will be Dial A for Aunties as well.
Fingers crossed.
Now, on that note, there's a unique sense of, your own background, so to speak. You clearly have, you're a member of the Indonesian can I say diaspora? Or would you say you would identify as such? Yeah, but you also have Chinese heritage, I believe, and yet you grew up, or rather you were exposed throughout extended periods of your upbringing to both American and British cultures as well. So you are, by all means and senses of the word, someone who embodies globalization and epitomizes cultural amalgamation and also synthesis. To what extent do you find these different labels and identities coming together in your writings, or do you feel that sometimes you have to compartmentalize and really just highlight and bring out particular aspects? For instance, you're being Indonesian or you're being American in devising the plot lines and the characterizations of, say, Dial A for Aunties or your other work. So to what extent do they come together or come apart, really, in your creative process?
Yeah, it's very interesting because, so my family is Chinese. All of my grandparents came from China to Indonesia. Actually, one of my grandfathers, my maternal grandfather, he was actually sold to Indonesia, which I find like it just blows my mind, that happened so recently. So I feel very Chinese, but at the same time, I also like grew up in Indonesia. So it's very interesting, I guess. Always kind of feeling like you're an outsider in a way. And I'm sure you understand this because you spent so much time overseas. So then that allows me to kind of observe cultural differences, kind of from like a distance. But I didn't start writing about like Chinese Indonesian culture until I moved back to Indonesia from England, and my husband is British. So we moved back, and then he was like, "You need to write about your family because they are crazy." And I was like, "No, they're so boring." And he was like, No, there's nothing boring about them. Like, you need to write about them. And so he was kind of pointing out all of the ways that, they're very interesting, I guess. So, and I was like, okay, you're right. Like, I should write about them because they are very different from like Western families. But I needed my husband to be the one pointing it out. And one example, I don't know why all of my examples revolve around food poisoning. I think because it happens a lot in Indonesia. So my husband was poisoned, obviously, when he moved to Indonesia. My parents messaged it on like the family WhatsApp group. And within like 3 hours, he had like 14 different remedies for food poisoning. And they were all like, all of my aunts and uncles were like, you must take this one. This is the best one. And so my poor husband, he was kind of like, okay, I'll take it, because he didn't want to like offend them. But that was one. And another example I had was I had food poisoning like about a year ago, and it was bad enough that I actually went to the urgent care, and I had like an IV drip. And so I was just kind of lying in bed, kind of waiting for the IV drip to finish. And then suddenly this random auntie like parted the screen and was like, "I heard you got food poisoning." And I was like, "Yes, I did." And she was like, "Yeah, where did you get it?" And I was like, I don't know, I think this restaurant. And then she started like scolding me. She was like, you need to be more careful with what you eat, And I was like, "Oh, I'm sorry, auntie." I don't even know this woman, but I was like, "Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes, you're right." And then the nurse came by to check, and she didn't get rid of the auntie. She was just like, "Okay, like 15 more minutes." But things like these, like that would never happen in England or in the US. Can you imagine, like, if some random auntie, like, gives you advice? So, I don't know, I love it. I would not change it at all.
You've mentioned England several times, thus far, and of course, I know your husband hails from England as well. So moving on to your Oxford years, right? You read your Masters of Fine Arts there in Oxford at Kellogg College, as we came to realise just then in conversation. I was just wondering, how has Oxford shaped your life and also, if at all, the way you write, in your opinion?
It's kind of hard to say. Obviously I did the Masters in Creative Writing, so that must have influenced it. But it was so long ago, because like I said, it took me 10 years. And during those 10 years, I never stopped writing, so I was always learning. But Oxford is so interesting because like what we were discussing earlier, I've never gone to a place that was so clearly catered only towards students. And, I loved it as a student. And as soon as I graduated, I was like, man, screw this place. I'm out of here. There's like nothing left if you're not a student. You're just kind of sliced out of life there. So it's very interesting. There's such a distinct divide between what is accessible in Oxford. I don't know if you found that to be the case.
Certainly, I think the town and gown divide is pretty stark, actually, and it also it's reflected in the attitudes of folks in a university, outside the university, but in Oxford. And of course, once summer comes around, it's really a ghost town in many ways. But it's still, in a city by UK standards, by British standards. But on that, because the reason why I asked was I just think that a lot of the imagery and the scene setting in your works, it's detailed, but it's also poetic, and there's this sense of whilst the storyline is obviously incredibly fast-paced, right? But you spend a lot of time crafting that exact scene, for instance, in terms of the cake in the scene of the wedding in Dale for Aunties, so on and so forth, or just outlining the flowers and the colours and the imagery there. What makes you spend so much time thinking about the imagery then in a scene setting? Is that part and parcel of your repertoire, or do you see this as merely a coincidence in your works?
Maybe it comes from nostalgia of wanting to go back to that place, because Dale for Aunties is set in California. And I always miss California, so I'm always trying to go back, recreate what I long for, I guess, in my books.
And what do you see as the most challenging part of that recreative process? Is it the accuracy, or is it the ability to identify some deeper meaning to scenery that you find most difficult, or do you just see it as a straightforward process? I can recall the image in my head, I'm going to paint it with words, and voila, eureka,
No, I find that really challenging, because I don't naturally describe things very well. I do dialogue well, but scene setting is very slow going for me. Yeah.
So on dialogue, now hands up if you're a aspiring writer in the audience, if you want to write well, in the audience. Writing for a career? We've got one, we've got two. Any more hands, Going once, going twice? All right. Hands up if you'd like to improve your ability to communicate in English in general. Okay, so everyone's pretty confident of their own language capabilities. Well, I was just going to ask you, Jesse, in terms of dialogue writing, what are the top tips you'd give to folks who are writing, dialogue in, say, novels and even plays?
So I like to actually read aloud while I'm writing. Kind of just under my breath, because it's really weird, especially if you're in a cafe, people are like, oh my God, what is this weird person doing? But actually, if you do that, you can really hear, does it sound stilted? And then another problem that I find with writing dialogue is that we want to write in complete sentences, but we very rarely speak in complete sentences, even when I'm trying to sound really smart in front of you guys, but my sentences now are still broken. I'm having new thoughts come up in the middle of sentences. So don't be afraid to do that when you write your dialogue.
And I suppose there's also this ability on a part of the writer that you need to really adapt it to the speaker when it comes to the education background or their own, their culture, their gender, and even their age, right? So there's this personalized or individualized dimension of dialogue writing. And whilst that might be straightforward when it comes to, say, writing the dialogue or the speech of someone who's 20, 30 years old, how do you find the words and also the unique diction for, say, the aunties and the uncles? Is it really inspired by the folks around you, or is there more to that process of trying to uncover the voices of, say, folks that are so drastically different from yourselves as characters in your works?
No, I'm too lazy to make that stuff up. No, they're 100% based on my mom and and my dad.
That's awesome. And I know many of you in the audience are dying to ask questions, so I'll just hog the mic for two more questions before I open up the floor. But one question based on your presentation just then is it's a question about how to deal with failure, and you gave us incredibly sound tips and advice on persistence, on thinking more carefully about the kind of feedback you solicit and also get, and finally, of course, how to engage meaningfully with setbacks. But say, if I'm someone who really wants to get good at writing, and yet each and every time I try to pitch something, I'm told that my writing is just not there, what advice would you give me, hypothetically, when it comes to improving just the quality and technical capabilities and capacities of my writing, especially when it comes to fiction?
I would say read a lot, but actually I do have more tips
Great.
and tricks. Okay, so I talked a bit about perfectionism, and perfectionism is really harmful because it leads to procrastination. So I would sit down to write, and then 3 hours later, I would realize, oh, I've just been scrolling through Twitter. And it's not laziness, because I do want to do the work, but my perfectionism was getting in the way. So I realized that part of my problem was that I was thinking of finished books, like books that I find in the bookstores. Then I realized, well, why am I comparing my first draft to someone else's, 20th draft or whatever? And so now what I do when I sit down to write, I literally say to myself, I'm going to write trash. I'm going to write trash. And this gives me permission. It kind of unblocks me, from the fear of creating something bad. And I don't know about you, but I have this voice in my head that's really mean and horrible. And as I write, this voice is telling me, oh, this is so bad. The writing is so awkward. The plot doesn't make sense, and on and on and on. So I find that I need to do exercises like writing fast. So I set a 15-minute timer. And for those 15 minutes, I do nothing but write. Like, I don't even let myself take a sip of water for those 15 minutes. And sometimes, even now, when that voice is just really loud and kind of overwhelming, I find that I have to cover my screen so I don't see what I'm writing. So I just take a piece of paper and I fold it over my laptop screen. And sometimes that's the only way that I can write. I also set very realistic goals, like a very definite kind of like word count goal every day. And I find that that's how I really improved my writing.
Discipline.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So I also got rid of the mindset that, being a writer is somehow different or unique. And I kind of started treating it as a job. So I write every weekday, so Monday to Friday, even when I don't feel inspired or anything, even when I feel like the writing is super boring and mediocre, I have to sit down and do it. And I wasn't doing this when I was doing my program in Oxford. So that's why when you ask, like, oh, did that shape you as a writer? I feel like when I went to Oxford, I was way too young and immature to actually get the most out of my program. And it wasn't until after I graduated that I started doing these exercises. Then I really noticed a big change in my writing.
And just out of interest, because some folks would say that good writing comes with life experience, and it comes with, aging, like fine wine, and yet others would say it's about the freshness, so you can still write incredibly sophisticated and profound works despite being relatively young. What do you make of this,
Yeah, I definitely agree that for myself, I had a lot of maturing to go through before I could pour some of that life experience into my writing. But, there are a lot of very young, very talented writers out there who have released very successful books. So I hate them. So.
But you're also relatively young, so I guess
thank you.
Self-hatred. No. Now, on that note, I'm going to open up the floor to questions in the audience. So if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand. Relatively Yes, conspicuously, so I can notice you. And please state your name, your affiliation, and also the question. Thank you very much. So I see that gentleman over there, that very dapper gentleman. Hi, Nicholas.
Hi, Brian. I'm Nicholas. I'm a journalist. I'm not here wearing that hat today. So my question, we already talked about the idea of representation for Asian stories, Asian American stories. But I also feel like there's been a growing embrace, let's say, both commercially and critically, of young adult fiction, of genre fiction. There's a growing sense, again, both commercial and critically, kind of take that work seriously as creative works. So it's not just blockbusters, it's not just literary stuff. It's all this stuff in between that actually lives and actually broadly popular. From your view as an author, how do you understand kind of the growing kind of critical and commercial power of young adult fiction?
So I write young adult. And it's very interesting writing young adult. They're aimed at teenagers, and teenagers are painfully honest. But they're also very, very insightful. So one of my young adult books called The Obsession, it actually was my very first book deal, and it was a very small deal. And so I kind of expected it to fade into oblivion. But it actually went viral on TikTok, and so it's selling really, really well. And what's interesting is that I wrote it as kind of like a critique into unhealthy relationships. And, you know, I thought it was kind of an in-depth analysis of teenage relationships and all that very deep, meaningful literary stuff. But then I went on TikTok and I was reading the reviews, and so it's about a boy who starts stalking a girl. And all the comments were like, oh my gosh, I wish I had a boy who loves me enough to do this for me. And I'm like, no! It's not a romance, you guys. But, you know, the author can't go in and be like, you read it wrong. Like, no, you know, because once the book is out there, it's left up to the readers to interpret. So I don't know. It's very. I really like young adult because you can have all of this like complexity as you're writing it, and then the teenagers, you know, they'll just take what they want to see and extract from it. And then once in a while, I do see like a review which is like, oh wow, this book is so disturbing, you know, all of the psychological and like abusive aspects of the relationship, etc. But most of them are very much like, oh my God, I want a boyfriend like this. Why is my boyfriend not doing this? Why is my boyfriend not stalking me?
It's almost like the summer I turned pretty, you know. I've been following that adaptation into a TV series. But on the subject of young adult fiction, do you find that writing for that audience, which you've identified as, is more honest and more, I guess, you know, they tend to be relatively headstrong when it comes to reviewing work, so they don't have these presuppositions or prejudices or sort of filters concerning what's high cultural capital or low cultural capital, you know, so they're more candid reviewers, so to speak. What do you see as the greatest challenges beyond, you know, that need to grasp attention, presumably, but is there more to it when it comes to YA fiction as compared with fiction aimed at adults?
So you're right in that there are a lot more passionate reviewers in YA, and I love them. So I don't know if you've heard of this book, The Song of Achilles. So yeah, it's very popular, and it has these very popular Greek mythology characters, like Achilles. And in this book, it portrays him as being gay. And so it's very popular amongst teenagers, and now I'm hearing about teenagers in high school insisting to their teachers that Achilles was gay, and you just can't convince them otherwise because of this book, which is so excellent, and I'm like, well, this is amazing, it's kind of opened up a conversation for LGBT and representation of LGBT characters. And I don't know that the publishers saw this coming because it's not a young adult book, but I feel like young adult readers, they take whatever they want, and I just find that so refreshing.
You might also have folks believing that the British prince and also the son of the American president are seeing one another. But on that note, actually, how does the theme of LGBTQIA plus feature in your works, and do you see that as an important theme that you want to convey and also write about in your writings?
Yeah, so it is very important to me. It is also quite frustrating to me because a lot of communities that we live in, that I live in, are not safe communities to even talk about these things. It's why I haven't sold the Indonesian rights to my books, because I just don't want to open myself up to that kind of targeting. Yeah.
But just to press you further on that, some would say maybe powerful authors like yourself, may have precisely that responsibility to more aggressively push for visibility and also representation of individuals who are, say, members of the community and also other disempowered communities at large. And I'm not saying I agree with this view, but I suppose, what would you say to voices that say, Jesse, why don't you sell the rights to Indonesian producers and get the discourse out there, get them to think and start talking about these issues there?
Because I was scared. I'm living there. I always say, if we ever move out of Indonesia, then if we ever move out of a country where there is no chance of me going to prison, and leaving my kids without a mom, then I will be more vocal and brave. But just honestly, I'm too scared to do it.
And that's incredibly fair. Many authors around the world live under governments or societies that may not necessarily always tolerate the speech and ideologies they espouse. But on that note, any other questions from the floor? Wonderful, because I've got many more. So I want to talk about death. We've been very optimistic and buoyant over the past 50 minutes. So let's talk about death. Now, in many of your works, right, whether it be Ever Wang's The Unsolicited Advice or indeed Dial A for Aunties, death comes up. But it's treated almost like it's, not saying insignificant, because it's clearly a significant part of the plot, but it doesn't have the usual severity and grimness that's associated with it. Is that intentional? Can you perhaps tell us a bit more about your treatment of death as a subject and a motif in your works?
Yeah, it is intentional. So when I first started writing, I was writing dark thrillers and stuff. And then my readers would tell me, Jesse, your characters are too flippant about death. They need to be more serious. And so then when I wrote Dial A for Aunties, I was like, I'm going to lean into, the unserious part, the comedic part of death. And then I kind of found it a lot more refreshing. And to be honest, I feel like death is also a very easy way of getting tension and urgency in your book. So that's why I like it so much in my books.
That's super fair. And in fact, when I was reading Dial A for Aunties, I was thinking, there was a voice in my head saying, White Lotus. White Lotus. And I was wondering, have you watched White Lotus?
No, I haven't.
Okay, well, no spoilers there. But I was going to get you to comment on the White Lotus plotline. But on that, going back to the point concerning thrillers as well, death features obviously in a very different light in many thrillers. It's used almost as a as a definitive conclusion to something inescapable and inevitable, and I'm thinking It here, you know, referencing Stephen King, for instance. What is your favorite thriller novel and why?
Okay, it has to be Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn. So, like I said, you know, I love thrillers, but I wasn't reading many of them because they were very male-dominated and just had a lot of rape, very graphic rape and killing of female characters. And then Gillian Flynn came along with Gone Girl, and she just smashed the whole industry, created a whole new subsection of thriller, and all of a sudden, you know, it kind of turned the genre on its head. She kind of reclaimed it, I feel, for female writers, and that's why I think Gone Girl that's just like the, you know, of like.
It was turned into a movie, right? If I remember correctly. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and you know, just then on the question of Stephen King stuff, just going to go back to him because I think he's, you know, what many folks would definitively see as the most well-represented or renowned thriller author there is in a genre. What do you make of female thriller writers? And do you see any female thriller writers beyond, you know, Julia that you just named just then as being someone that inspired you or also shaped your writing and flow?
Oh, so many. There are just so many amazing female thriller writers now. I read a lot of Tana French, a lot of Alice Feeney, and very recently, R.F. Kuang, you mentioned. She was, well, she is. She's still a fantasy writer, I think, mostly. But she came out with Yellow Face, which is, I guess I would say, suspense novel, and it's amazing. I don't know if you've read it, but it's.
I'm halfway through it actually.
Yeah, I couldn't put it down. It's just so amazing, you know. Whoa, like what a takedown of the Western publishing industry.
That's right. I put it down actually to read your wonderful work. So, but. On publishing, and going back to your presentation again, when it comes to all these attempts at getting published, getting noticed, it must feel very frustrating, doesn't it? What would be, in your opinion, the biggest structural bottlenecks and defects in the current publishing industry for, say, writers of color or just young emerging writers?
So, oh my goodness, you would not believe the number of racially insensitive comments I've received. So when my old agent was sending out my children's fantasy, which is about a Chinese American boy, we kept getting rejections like, "Oh, this is so good, but we have a book coming out next year." About a Korean American boy. So they kind of like had this quota of like one Asian per year, you know? And it doesn't even matter which Asian, just any Asian. So you know, that was very frustrating to see. And again, this is why I'm so grateful for Crazy Rich Asians, because I think it increased the quota to like maybe 2 Asians a year. I don't know, but yeah, they really said it with their whole chest, you know, like, well, we have one Asian.
Is that
book.
Still the case right now? You know?
I think it's a lot better now.
Okay.
Like I said, you know, I think the quota has increased, but I do still think that there is a quota, whether or not they will ever like admit it.
To be like, you know.
He has a question.
Yes, and on that, Nicholas.
The mic. About what U.S. people are thinking, but maybe more from the audience standpoint. You know, again, kind of there does seem to be a greater comfort now amongst U.S. consumers to read, listen to, watch things that are not American. You know, there's obviously the greater embrace of K-pop. There's people watching Squid Game. Things a lot more. People are a lot more Americans at least appear to be a little bit more comfortable in experiencing cultural works that are not based in the American experience. I mean, obviously, with the experience, like Dale Ferrante's having to be set in LA, notwithstanding. But do you see, I mean, is that something that you're seeing as well, that audiences are a bit more comfortable in looking at works that are not based in the United States? And then what doors does that open for new kinds of stories, new kinds of writers?
Definitely, I think that they are a lot more comfortable, but I still think that there's a very specific, you know, like what they are comfortable with. So a lot of Korean, and then, you know, East Asia is always like, you know, Japan, you know, Chinese, and but I'm still not seeing that many Southeast Asian content that is being put out there. Like, as far as I know, I am the only Indonesian writer who has kind of made it in the US publishing scene. I'm seeing more Singaporean, but I think that's very much to do with Crazy Rich Asians. But I'm not seeing, like, you know, Filipino stories that much, or Thai or Vietnamese, like just very, very few and far in between. And I don't think that that's going to increase anytime soon, sadly.
Yeah, and if I could just, you know, ask you a follow-up on that, because I was just wondering, you know, we've talked a lot about the American audience and the American market, but maybe one angle, one reason why we haven't seen, say, Vietnamese or Filipino writers make it big in America thus far is that many more of the works they produce tend to be couched or published and circulated predominantly in their own national languages, whereas in the case of Indonesia, obviously, you know, writing in English grants us an access, or grants you an access to, you know, predominantly English-speaking audience. Are there plans to translate your works, as I'm sure some of them have already been, into a wider range of languages going forward to access and break into markets like the Chinese market, for instance, for which I'm sure many would find your sharing and experiences relatable in some ways?
Yeah, so this was something that they taught us at Oxford, actually. So they were saying, like, if you want to be published in the US or the UK, then you have to just go through the US and the UK. And then from there, you have a much higher chance of getting your work be translated into different languages. But you don't go the other way. Like, you never hear of, you know, or very, very rarely, of like books that are, say, published in Germany, getting, you know, coming into the US. Like, so all of the other countries are a lot more insular, I guess. Once you're published in Germany, that's it. You're just published in Germany. And so it's interesting how the US and the UK kind of become like a gateway to the rest of the world.
And do you see that as a worrying or problematic phenomenon? So this gatekeeping function almost, right? The markets determine who sells and who doesn't.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's the sort of cultural gatekeeping that we're seeing right now.
Yes.
But I guess that's also being throttled somewhat by, say, the translation of Chinese works, you know, like The Three-Body Problem or Living, you know, 活着 from Chinese into English. And on that subject of Mandarin speaking, I know you speak Mandarin. And you
not well. Okay.
How does that, do you see a Chinese heritage as shaping or inspiring you with your writings in ways that more than just, you know, say, being a member of the diaspora in Indonesia? Have you tried to capture Chineseness, or not being Chinese, rather, in your works?
Oh, yeah, totally. Because I think my parents, they mostly identify as Chinese, despite having grown up in Indonesia. But and when I got married, my parents were very insistent on having Chinese ceremonies, like the tea ceremony. Like there was no Indonesian ceremony going on. So yeah, it's definitely like a big part of my identity.
Wonderful. And now we have time to take more questions from the audience and the floor. So please don't be shy, you know. It's very rare that we have Jessie here with us in Hong Kong. Is this your first time in Hong Kong?
Yeah, it might as well be.
Brilliant. Well, I hope it hasn't been a shabby experience thus far. But any other question? Yes, so we have two. So we'll just take the first on the first row and the second lady on the third row. So start with the first row. We've got a microphone.
Very short question. Just wondering, what is your mother tongue?
My mother tongue? I guess I would have to say Indonesian, but I speak Indonesian so badly because I moved away when I was 7 years old, so I have a 7-year-old's vocabulary of Indonesian now. And I moved to Singapore, so then English became my first language. Yeah.
Thank you. And the lady on the third row, the microphone. We're just trying to record it, actually, for posterity.
It was going back to your question or your comments about the English and the publishers and what they're looking for. I remember having lunch, a BritCham lunch years ago with a lady that used to work for Penguin or Macmillan or something, and she was saying one easy way to get in sometimes is, depending obviously who your agent is to go to the Australian or go to the Indian bit of Macmillan or Penguin, whoever it is, and then that gets you in, and then the distribution goes that way. Would you agree with that? Particularly if you want to comment, if you want to we ought to be sort of seeing more of the Southeast Asian literature.
I wouldn't, because there's still very limited movement in that direction. So from Australia to the US or UK is still very limited. You're more likely to get from US or UK to Australia. And then definitely no on the Indian or Southeast Asian arms of, Penguin or whatever, because, they like operate very, very separately from the US and the UK arms.
Thank you very much. Are there other questions in the audience? Lovely. Lady over there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming to Hong Kong. This is really good. So you mentioned a couple of times that your stories are all based on your family and your parents, your mom and dad. How much input do you get from them, and do they get to see the draft before it's published? And do they have any impact and influence on they'll say, oh, you got that wrong, you have to change it because it's factually not right? And the food poisoning remedies, they give you 15 things that you should put into the book. So if you could talk a bit about that.
I only ever let my mom read it after when it's way too late for her to change anything. Because she does that. She's like, I don't see that. Or, and I'm like, yes, you do. But happily, she has approved of Dial A for Aunties and Vera Wong. So Vera Wong is 100% based on her. And she's like, I love Vera. I would love to meet her. I was like, look in the mirror. And you'll meet her. And then there are books that she disapproved. So my young adult rom-com, she really hated it because the characters are so horny. And I'm like, Mom, they're teenagers. Of course they're going to be thinking about sex all the time. And she was like, I wasn't like that when I was a teen. And you know what? I believe her. I totally believe that she was not like that. But, again, she read it, and it was too late. It's already out. It's already published. She can't change a thing. So that's my strategy.
Do you see fiction as an attempt to critique reality, to escape reality, or as a mirror of reality, or all of the above?
Or payback to my parents for what I've had to put up with for
That's
over 30 years.
Reality. So what is the role of fiction, though, on a sort of more normative level? Do you see it as bearing any political significance and purpose, or do you see fiction as merely art that's independent of politics? I know this is a more philosophical question, but I'm just trying to, ask questions that might not have come up in previous interviews because I've watched plenty of them.
Yeah. I think, so for myself, depending on which genre I'm writing. Some of my books are more political than others. So I have a book coming out. It's an adult suspense. It's called I'm Not Done With You Yet. And it's very dark. It's not at all comedic. And that one, I feel like I had a very clear political and philosophical agenda, I guess, that was very much on the surface of my mind as I was writing it. You know, whereas things like Dial A for Aunties, you know, people can read them politically, but the politics definitely come as an afterthought when I was writing it.
Is there any chance, I know you don't want to give away spoilers, but is there any chance we can hear about the politics undergirding your current work in progress?
Or you mean the one that's coming out?
Yeah, the dark.
Oh yeah,
Yes.
the dark suspense.
Why?
So you know, I always have very strong feelings about gender politics, and so that was the main thrust, I guess, of the story. It's about toxic female friendships and again, you know, my toxic trait of killing male characters, which I do a lot in this book. You know, I kind of use the female characters, you know, they're the players, and then the male characters are kind of the pieces that they move around. And I hope to kind of shine a light on how traditionally female characters are treated in suspense novels. Especially by male authors. So I'm coming off so man-hating.
No, that sounds awesome. You know, man-hating is, I mean, that's one way of putting it. I was going to say egalitarianism is another way of phrasing it. But
I prefer that.
yes, that's right. But on that, actually, because when it comes to the subject of not liking men or critiquing the patriarchy, Sylvia Plath writes a fair number of poems, and also, of course, the bell jar on, you know, the relationship between herself and various men, and also men in general as a concept. To what extent, if at all, do you see yourself as drawing from, say, Plath when you engage in such writings? Or maybe she doesn't feature at all, right? Or...
I mean, I love Plath. It's very hard to say, like, how much does a specific thing, you know, whether it be an author or a source material, you know, even a TV show or whatever, how much that has shaped you, because all of these things are kind of experiences that, you know, leave their imprints on you as you go about your day-to-day life, right? So I don't know. Yeah.
And on that note, are there any other questions in the floor before we close for today? All right, I guess I have one last question I'd like to ask you, Jesse, and that is, you know, you have many, many fans around the world, and of course here today we saw a very small segment of your huge fan base here in Hong Kong. What would you like to say to folks, especially young writers or aspiring writers out there here today, you know, aspiring writers, great students, authors and so forth? What would be your ultimate sort of nugget of wisdom you'd like to leave them with, so to speak?
Well, to aspiring writers, my number one advice is always to lower your standards, you know, and allow yourself to make mistakes and create trash, because that's the only way that you will ever learn. And just to be kind to yourself, and also, you know, it's so tough trying to break into publishing. Publishing is kind of like a really messed up industry, as you would know if you read Yellow Face by R.F. Kuang. So all of the rejections, it's not necessarily on you, you know. It's that whole bullshit about like, oh, well, you know, we already have our one, you know, Asian story, so a lot of things are so outside of your control, so don't internalize the rejections.
Thank you so much, Jesse. I'm sure, we can all agree that this has been a splendiferous journey. It's a wonderful, wonderful privilege to have you here with us here in Hong Kong. So please, let's give it up for the one and only Jesse Sutanto. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for hosting me.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.